12-year-old boy begs for leftover cake in a cafe. When cafe owner recognizes him, he broke down in tears. Would you be finished with that cake soon, ma'am?" The small voice barely carried across the bustling noise of Sweet Memories Cafe, but it caught James Collins' attention immediately. Through the afternoon rush of customers, his eyes found the source. A thin boy, no more than 12, hovering awkwardly beside a corner table. The child's oversized jacket hung from his frame like a sail without wind, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the frayed edges of his sleeves. The woman at the table looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "Your cake," the boy repeated, pointing to the half-eaten slice of chocolate ganache. "If you're not going to finish it, I wondered if maybe—" His voice trailed off, the courage that had propelled him forward now failing. James stepped from behind the counter, his brow furrowing. In the 5 years since opening Sweet Memories, he'd built it from a small bakery into the crown jewel of his culinary empire. The cafe, with its warm lighting and hand-carved wooden furniture, was the most exclusive dessert destination in the city. Reservations were booked weeks in advance. People didn't beg for leftovers here. "Is there a problem?" James asked, approaching the table. The woman looked relieved at his intervention. "This child is asking for my leftover cake," she said, her voice tinged with discomfort. I didn't know what to say. James turned to address the boy directly, prepared to gently but firmly escort him out. The cafe's reputation had been built on elegance and exclusivity. But when the child looked up, the words died in James's throat. Those eyes, dark brown with flecks of amber when the light hit them just right, eyes that seemed too old for such a young face, eyes that carried a familiar sadness he'd seen before, not on this boy, but in photographs and stories told with love and heartbreak. "Sarah's boy," James whispered, the words escaping like a prayer. The room seemed to tilt. James's hand found the edge of the table, gripping it as the memories flooded back with brutal clarity. Sarah, his wife, coming home from volunteering at the orphanage. Her face animated as she described a special little boy who'd never had a birthday cake. The same boy she'd promised to bake for personally. The promise death had prevented her from keeping. Before we dive deep into this tear-jerking story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. "Sir, are you okay?" The woman's voice sounded distant. James felt wetness on his cheeks before he realized he was crying. The boy stared at him, confusion and alarm replacing his earlier hesitation. "I'm sorry," the child said quickly, backing away. "I shouldn't have asked. I'll go." "No." James's voice came out louder than intended, drawing stares from nearby tables. He drew a shuddering breath, trying to compose himself. "No, please, don't go." The cafe had fallen unusually quiet, customers watching the strange tableau with undisguised curiosity. Melissa, the head waitress, moved toward them with concern etched on her face. "Mr. Collins, should I call someone?" James shook his head, unable to look away from the boy. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The child hesitated, wariness evident in his stance. "Ethan," he finally said. The name hit James like a physical blow. Ethan. Of course it was Ethan. How many times had Sarah mentioned him? How many times had she described the quiet, thoughtful boy who loved to watch her bake during her visits to the orphanage? "Ethan," James repeated, tasting the name that had been merely a story until now. "Would you like a fresh slice of cake?" "Any kind you want?" Confusion flickered across Ethan's face, suspicion following closely behind. Life had clearly taught him to distrust unexpected kindness. "Why?" he asked bluntly. An honest question deserved an honest answer, but James couldn't form the words to explain. How could he tell this child that his late wife had spoken of him so often that James sometimes felt he knew him? That Sarah's final wishes had included making sure this boy finally got a birthday cake of his own? "Because I think we should talk," James said instead. "Please." Something in his tone must have convinced Ethan, because after a long moment the boy gave a small nod. James gestured toward an empty table in the corner, more private than the others. "Melissa, could you bring us— What kind of cake would you like, Ethan?" The boy's eyes widened slightly at being offered a choice. "Chocolate?" he asked, as if expecting the offer to be withdrawn. "The triple chocolate dream cake," James instructed Melissa. "2 slices and hot chocolate for both of us." As they sat across from each other at the small table, James studied Ethan more carefully. His clothes were clean but worn, his hair cut unevenly as if done in haste. There was a wariness in his posture that spoke of hard-earned caution, but underneath it James could see something else, a flicker of the bright, curious child Sarah had described. "Do I know you?" Ethan finally asked, breaking the uncomfortable silence between them. James shook his head slowly. "No, but I think I know you. Or about you, at least." He paused, unsure how to continue. "Did you ever know a teacher at the orphanage named Sarah? Sarah Collins?" The change in Ethan's expression was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened, and for a brief moment the guarded look vanished completely. "Miss Sarah. You knew Miss Sarah." The words tumbled out, tinged with both excitement and disbelief. Before James could answer, Melissa arrived with their order. 2 generous slices of the cafe's signature chocolate cake sat before them, layers of dark chocolate sponge alternating with milk chocolate mousse and bittersweet ganache. Steam rose from the hot chocolate, topped with a swirl of whipped cream. As Melissa retreated, Ethan stared at the dessert with undisguised longing but didn't reach for it. "It's really okay," James encouraged. "It's for you." Ethan picked up his fork with careful precision, as if handling something precious. When he took his first bite, his eyes closed momentarily, savoring the rich flavor. "Miss Sarah used to tell us about her husband who made the best cakes in the world," Ethan said after swallowing. "Are you him?" The question, so simple and direct, made James's throat tighten again. "Yes," he managed. "I'm James Collins. Sarah was my wife." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Was?" he echoed, the single word heavy with understanding beyond his years. James nodded, finding it harder to speak than he'd anticipated. "She passed away 2 years ago. Cancer." The boy set his fork down carefully, as if the cake had suddenly lost its sweetness. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Nobody at the orphanage told us why she stopped coming. One day she was just gone." Something twisted in James's chest, a sharp, familiar pain. How many people had Sarah touched with her kindness? How many had been left wondering when she disappeared from their lives? In his own grief, he'd never considered the ripple effects of her absence. "I should have told them," James admitted. "I should have done a lot of things." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows with growing urgency. The cafe's warm lights seemed to glow brighter in response, creating a bubble of comfort against the gathering darkness. Most of the afternoon customers had departed, leaving only a few regulars lingering over coffee and dessert. "Miss Sarah used to talk about making me a birthday cake," Ethan said suddenly, his fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "She said it would have 3 layers and chocolate frosting with rainbow sprinkles on top." A small smile touched his lips before fading. It was just a nice thing to say, I guess. James felt as if he'd been struck. Sarah had mentioned that cake so many times, had even written the recipe in her special journal, the one James couldn't bring himself to open after her death. "She meant it," James said firmly. "Sarah never made promises she didn't intend to keep." Ethan looked up, those familiar eyes searching James's face. "Then why did she leave?" The question contained no accusation, only a child's honest confusion, but it cut deeper than any blame could have. How could James explain that Sarah had fought until her last breath? That she'd made lists of all the things she needed to finish, all the promises to keep? She didn't want to, was all he could manage. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of the woman who had connected them across an impossible divide. James watched as Ethan took another bite of cake, smaller this time, savoring it as if committing the taste to memory. "Why are you here, Ethan?" James asked gently. "At the cafe, I mean. Why were you asking for leftover cake?" Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly. "I was hungry," he said with a shrug that aimed for casual but missed by a mile. "And everyone says this place has the best cake in the city." "Are you still at the orphanage?" The boy shook his head. "Foster home. My third one this year." "And they don't?" James hesitated, searching for the right words. "They don't make sure you have enough to eat?" "They're okay," Ethan said quickly, too quickly. "There's just a lot of kids, and sometimes I miss dinner because I'm late getting back." "Late from where?" Ethan's gaze slid away. "Just walking around, looking at things." The evasion was obvious, but James didn't press. He'd been a child once, too, with secrets he'd guarded fiercely. Instead, he watched as Ethan methodically worked his way through the cake, taking small bites as if to make it last as long as possible. "Do they know you're here now? Your foster parents?" A flicker of something, guilt, fear, crossed Ethan's face. "They're working. They won't notice if I'm back before dinner." James checked his watch. Nearly 5 o'clock. "When is dinner?" 6:30. "But it's fine. I know the way back." Outside, the rain had turned into a proper downpour. James imagined Ethan walking through it, that too large jacket providing little protection, arriving soaked at a house that might not even notice his absence. "I could drive you," he offered. "Save you getting wet." Ethan shook his head firmly. "No thanks, I'm okay." The refusal stung more than it should have. James reminded himself that he was a stranger to this boy, regardless of how familiar Ethan felt to him. Trust would take time, if there was time to be had at all. "Will you come back?" The question escaped before James could consider its implications. "To the cafe, I mean. Tomorrow, maybe. I could have a fresh cake waiting." Suspicion darkened Ethan's expression. "Why?" It was a fair question, one James wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because you're the boy Sarah couldn't stop talking about? Because seeing you makes me feel closer to her? Because I've spent 2 years drowning in grief and suddenly I can breathe again?" "Because Sarah would have wanted it," he said simply. "And because I think maybe we both miss her." Ethan studied him for a long moment, his young face solemn with an assessment no child should have needed to develop. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I might," he said cautiously, "if I can get away again." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough to kindle a small flame of hope in James's chest, the first he'd felt in longer than he cared to remember. "Here," James said, reaching for a napkin and pen. He wrote down his personal cell number. "If you need anything at all, you can call me, day or night." Ethan took the napkin with visible reluctance but folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I should go now," he said, pushing back his chair. "Thanks for the cake." "Wait." James hurried behind the counter and returned with a small box. Inside were 2 more slices of the chocolate cake. "For later," he explained, holding it out. The naked longing on Ethan's face made James's heart constrict. The boy reached for the box with reverent hands. "Miss Sarah used to bring us cookies sometimes," Ethan said softly. "She said that sweets make the world seem brighter, even on gray days." James felt tears threatening again. It was exactly the sort of thing Sarah would say, had said countless times as she baked for friends, for family, for the children she adored. She was right about that, he managed. Ethan nodded solemnly, then clutched the cake box to his chest and headed for the door. At the threshold he paused and looked back, rain creating a silver curtain behind him. She talked about you too, you know. She said you were the kindest man she'd ever met. And then he was gone, a small figure darting through the rain, quickly swallowed by the gathering dusk. James stood motionless, staring at the empty doorway, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. The kindest man she'd ever met. When had he last shown kindness to anyone? When had he last thought of someone else's pain instead of his own? For the first time in 2 years, James Collins felt something crack in the careful fortress he'd built around his grief. And for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Sleep evaded James that night. He lay awake in his spacious penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling as rain continued to drum against the windows. The encounter with Ethan played on repeat in his mind. The boy's thin frame, those hauntingly familiar eyes, the careful way he'd eaten his cake as if each bite might be his last. Shortly after midnight, James gave up on sleep entirely. He padded barefoot across the polished hardwood floors to the walk-in closet that had once been Sarah's. He'd left it untouched after her death, unable to face the task of sorting through her belongings. Now, guided by some instinct he couldn't name, he pulled the chain on the overhead light and stepped inside. Sarah's scent had long since faded, but her presence remained in the colorful clothes still hanging in neat rows, in the collection of scarves draped over hooks, in the photographs tucked into the mirror frame. James ran his fingers lightly over the fabrics, remembering how she'd looked in each outfit, the occasions they'd celebrated together. At the back of the closet, on the highest shelf, sat a stack of journals. Sarah had been an avid writer, documenting everything from daily observations to recipes to plans for the future. James had avoided those journals like a man avoiding open flame, terrified of the pain they might ignite. Now, he reached up and carefully brought down the topmost journal, a leather-bound book with a tree embossed on its cover. Sarah's final journal. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing her flowing handwriting, still so vibrant it seemed impossible she was gone. James carried the journal to the living room and settled into his favorite armchair. Outside, the city lights glimmered through the rain-streaked windows, creating wavering patterns on the walls. He took a deep breath and began to read. The early entries were cheerful, filled with plans for the spring garden she'd never plant and the summer vacation they'd never take. As he read further, the tone shifted. Sarah had known she was sick before she told him. She'd suspected for weeks, hiding her fears behind bright smiles and enthusiastic plans. James wiped away tears as he continued through the months of treatment, Sarah's determination never flagging even as her body weakened. Her entries about the orphanage children were particularly detailed, as if writing about them gave her strength. And there, appearing more frequently than any other name, was Ethan. Ethan helped me sort books today. Such careful hands for a child his age. He asked me why some stories have happy endings and others don't. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes life doesn't give us the endings we deserve? Ethan was quiet again today. The other children were making Valentine's cards, but he sat alone by the window. When I asked what was wrong, he said Valentine's Day is for people with families. My heart breaks for this child who believes love isn't meant for him. I promised Ethan a birthday cake today. His eyes lit up like I'd offered him the moon. He's never had one. Can you imagine? 10 years without anyone marking the day you were born. I've decided. Chocolate cake with rainbow sprinkles. July 15th. I've already started planning the design. July 15th. James checked the calendar on his phone. Just 3 weeks away. He continued reading until he reached the final entries, written in a hand that had grown increasingly shaky as Sarah's strength failed. Things I need James to know. 1. Being loved by him was the greatest gift of my life. 2. The children at Harmony House will need someone after I'm gone. 3. Especially Ethan. Promise me you'll find him, James 4. Bake him that birthday cake. Recipe on page 42. James flipped to page 42, where Sarah had meticulously written out a recipe titled Ethan's Birthday Surprise. Beside it was a sketch of a 3-tiered cake with elaborate decorations and a note. He deserves something spectacular. Every child should feel special on their birthday. The journal slipped from James's hands onto the floor. He buried his face in his palms, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. How had he missed this? How had he been so consumed by his own grief that he'd ignored Sarah's final wishes? By the time dawn broke, casting pale golden light across the rain-washed city, James had made his decision. He showered, dressed, and headed to the cafe earlier than usual, his mind racing with plans. Melissa looked surprised when he unlocked the front door at 5:30 a.m., a full hour before her usual arrival. "Mr. Collins, is everything all right?" "I need your help," James said, hanging up his coat. "We're going to make a special cake today." "Of course." Melissa followed him into the kitchen where James was already gathering ingredients. "May I ask what kind of cake?" "A birthday cake, for a child who's never had one." Understanding dawned on Melissa's face. "The boy from yesterday?" James nodded, pulling Sarah's journal from his bag and opening it to the recipe. "His name is Ethan. And I made a promise to my wife that I intend to keep." Throughout the morning, James worked alongside his staff, his hands remembering skills he hadn't used personally in too long. The cafe opened at its usual time, but James remained in the kitchen, focused intently on creating the perfect birthday cake. By noon, there was still no sign of Ethan. James found himself checking the door every few minutes, hope rising and falling with each new customer. As the afternoon wore on, his anxiety grew. What if Ethan didn't come back? What if the boy had decided James was just another adult making empty promises? "He'll come," Melissa assured him, noticing his frequent glances toward the entrance. Children can sense when someone genuinely cares. But as closing time approached with no sign of Ethan, even Melissa's certainty began to waver. The cake sat in the refrigerator, its 3 chocolate tiers covered in smooth ganache and decorated with rainbow sprinkles exactly as Sarah had described. "Maybe tomorrow," Melissa suggested gently as she prepared to leave. "He might have had school or chores." James nodded absently, but a growing sense of dread had settled in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He thought of Ethan's evasive answers about his foster home, the way the boy had refused a ride. Making a sudden decision, James grabbed his keys. "Lock up for me, would you? There's something I need to do." "Where are you going?" Melissa called after him. "To find Ethan," James replied, already halfway out the door. "I should have done it yesterday." His first stop was Harmony House Orphanage, where Sarah had volunteered for years. The building was older than he remembered, its brick facade faded but well-maintained. A colorful playground stood in contrast to the institutional architecture, evidence of Sarah's fundraising efforts before her illness. The director, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Chen, remembered him immediately. "Mr. Collins," she said warmly, ushering him into her modest office. "It's been too long. We've missed seeing you." Guilt twisted in James's chest. He should have continued Sarah's work here, should have maintained the connection to a place she'd loved so dearly. "I'm looking for Ethan," he said without preamble. "He was one of Sarah's special students. He's in foster care now, but I don't know where." Mrs. Chen's expression softened with understanding. "Ethan Miller? Yes, I remember him well. Such a serious little boy. He was placed with the Dawsons about 2 months ago. His 3rd placement this year, I believe." "Do you have their address? It's important." She hesitated. "I'm not supposed to give out that information, Mr. Collins. Confidentiality rules." "Please," James interrupted. "Sarah made me promise to find him, to bake him a birthday cake." The words sounded ridiculous said aloud, but Mrs. Chen's expression told him she understood completely. "Sarah always worried about him," she said softly. She said he reminded her of someone, lost and trying so hard to be brave. She studied James for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I can't give you the address, but I can call the Dawsons and let them know you're looking for Ethan. If they agree, I'll connect you." It wasn't what James had hoped for, but it was a start. He nodded gratefully and waited as Mrs. Chen made the call. Her increasingly concerned expression told him everything he needed to know before she even hung up. "Ethan ran away 3 days ago," she said, her voice tight with worry. "The Dawsons said he's done this before, usually coming back after a day or so, but this time—" She shook her head. "They were about to call the police when you arrived." The world tilted beneath James's feet. 3 days. Ethan had been alone on the streets for 3 days before wandering into Sweet Memories Café. Where had he been sleeping? What had he been eating? And, most importantly, where was he now? "I need to find him," James said, his voice hardening with resolve. "He came to my café yesterday, but I let him walk away in the rain. I should have—" He broke off, the weight of his regret nearly choking him. Mrs. Chen placed a comforting hand on his arm. "This isn't your fault, Mr. Collins. Ethan has had a difficult life. Trust doesn't come easily to him." "Does he have any friends? Places he might go?" She shook her head. "He keeps to himself, mostly. But—" Her eyes widened slightly. "There was an abandoned building near his previous foster home. The caretaker once mentioned finding Ethan there when he ran away before. It was scheduled for demolition, but I think it's still standing." "Where is it?" 20 minutes later, James stood before a dilapidated 3-story building in one of the city's forgotten corners. Faded, "No trespassing" signs hung from chain-link fencing that had been bent back to create an entrance. Rain had given way to a heavy mist that clung to everything, turning the world gray and indistinct. "Ethan!" James called, pushing through the makeshift entrance. "Are you in there? It's James Collins, from the café." Silence answered him. The building's broken windows stared back like vacant eyes, revealing glimpses of empty rooms beyond. James tried again, his voice echoing against concrete and metal. "I'm not here to take you back. I just want to make sure you're okay." A faint sound from the second floor caught his attention, something between a cough and a whimper. James rushed inside, navigating around debris and up a staircase that groaned beneath his weight. The second floor was divided into what might once have been offices or small apartments. He followed the sound to a room at the far end of the hallway. There, huddled in a corner on a nest of blankets and flattened cardboard, was Ethan. The boy looked up as James entered, his face flushed with fever, eyes glassy and unfocused. "Miss Sarah," he murmured, his voice cracking with dehydration. "You came back." James's heart clenched. He knelt beside the child, gently placing a hand on his forehead. Heat radiated from Ethan's skin, confirming what James already suspected. The boy was seriously ill. "It's James," he said softly. "Sarah's husband. Remember me? From the café?" Recognition flickered weakly in Ethan's eyes. "The cake man," he whispered. "That's right. I'm going to help you, Ethan. You're very sick." The boy tried to push himself up but fell back weakly. "Don't take me back there," he pleaded. "Please, I'll be good. I'll be quiet. Just don't make me go back." "I won't," James promised, though he had no idea how he would keep such a vow. "Right now, we need to get you to a doctor. Can you stand?" Ethan shook his head slightly, the movement clearly causing him pain. Without hesitation, James gathered the small boy in his arms, alarmed at how little he weighed. Ethan's body burned against him, radiating fever through the damp clothing. "Hold on to me," James instructed, carefully navigating back through the building. Ethan's head lolled against his shoulder, consciousness fading in and out. By the time they reached James's car, The boy had gone limp entirely, his breathing shallow and rapid. The emergency room was mercifully quiet when they arrived. A triage nurse took one look at Ethan and immediately ushered them into an examination room. James found himself answering a barrage of questions, many of which he couldn't answer. Age? Medical history? Allergies? Current medications? His name is Ethan Miller. He's 12. He's been living on the streets. That's all I know, James admitted, watching helplessly as medical staff converged around the small figure on the bed. An IV was inserted, vital signs checked, blood drawn for tests. "Are you a relative?" the nurse asked, eyeing him with professional suspicion. "No," James said. Then, surprising himself, "But I'm going to be his guardian." The declaration hung in the air between them, as surprising to James as it clearly was to the nurse. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. This wasn't just about fulfilling Sarah's wish anymore. Somehow, in the span of 24 hours, Ethan had become more than a promise to keep. He'd become a child James couldn't bear to fail. "I'll need to contact social services," the nurse said, her tone softening slightly. "He's a minor without a legal guardian present." James nodded. "I understand. But please, let me stay with him. He's scared and confused. He needs someone he knows." After a brief consultation with the attending physician, they allowed James to remain while they treated Ethan for pneumonia and severe dehydration. Hours passed in a blur of medical terminology and quiet efficiency as the hospital staff worked to stabilize the boy. It was past midnight when Ethan finally stirred, his fever reduced by medication and fluids. James, who had been dozing in a chair beside the bed, came instantly alert. "Hey there," he said gently. "How are you feeling?" Ethan blinked slowly, taking in the hospital room with evident confusion. "What happened?" "You got very sick. I found you in that abandoned building and brought you here." The boy's face crumpled slightly. "Are they going to send me back now?" James shook his head. "Not if I can help it." He leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "Ethan, I'd like you to come stay with me. Just until you're better," he added quickly, seeing the wariness return to the boy's expression. "My apartment has a guest room that nobody uses. You'd have your own space." "Why would you do that?" Ethan asked, suspicion clear in his voice despite his weakness. "You don't even know me." It was a fair question, one James had been asking himself throughout the long hours in the hospital. Why was he, a man who had carefully avoided emotional connections for 2 years, suddenly willing to upend his entire life for a child he barely knew? "Sarah knew you," he said simply. "She cared about you. And I think maybe taking care of you might be a way of taking care of a part of her that's still here." It wasn't a perfect answer, perhaps not even a good one, but it was honest. Ethan seemed to sense that, studying James's face with an intensity that belied his young age. "Would I have to go back to the Dawsons after?" he asked finally. "I don't know," James admitted. "That would be up to the social workers, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you're somewhere safe, somewhere you want to be." Ethan fell silent, his fingers plucking absently at the hospital blanket. After what seemed like an eternity, he gave a small nod. "Okay," he whispered, "but just until I'm better." Relief washed over James in a dizzying wave. "Just until you're better," he agreed. A social worker arrived the following morning, a brisk, efficient woman named Miss Patel who spoke rapidly and took copious notes. James explained the situation as best he could, emphasizing his connection through Sarah and his financial ability to provide for Ethan. "Temporary emergency placement is possible," Ms. Patel acknowledged after hearing him out. "Given the circumstances and the child's resistance to returning to his current foster home, but there would be home inspections, background checks, mandatory parenting classes." "Whatever it takes," James interrupted. "I own Sweet Memories Café and 3 other restaurants. I have resources. I can provide a stable environment." Miss Patel studied him over the rim of her glasses. "This isn't about resources, Mr. Collins. It's about commitment. This boy has been shuffled between homes his entire life. The last thing he needs is another temporary situation that falls apart when it becomes inconvenient." The words stung, but James recognized their truth. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'm not offering charity or convenience. I'm offering a home." The conviction in his voice seemed to satisfy her, at least temporarily. "We'll start the paperwork today," she said, closing her notebook. "In the meantime, Ethan can be discharged into your care once the doctors clear him. I'll need your address and contact information." As Ms. Patel left to make arrangements, James returned to Ethan's bedside, where the boy had been pretending to sleep through the entire conversation. "You can stop fake sleeping now," James said, smiling slightly. "She's gone." Ethan's eyes opened immediately. "Is it really happening? I'm coming to live with you?" "For now," James confirmed. "We have to convince Miss Patel that it's a good arrangement for both of us. Think you can help me with that?" A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips, the first genuine smile James had seen from him. "I can be very convincing when I want to be," the boy said with surprising gravity. James laughed, the sound strange and rusty to his own ears. When had he last laughed like that? "I believe you," he said. "Now get some rest. The doctor says we might be able to go home tomorrow if your fever stays down." Home. The word hung between them, fragile and full of possibility. 3 days later, James led Ethan into his penthouse apartment for the first time. The boy had been discharged that morning, still weak but significantly improved. He paused just inside the doorway, eyes widening as he took in the spacious living area with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. "You live here?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed with disbelief. James nodded, suddenly seeing his home through new eyes. The sleek, modern furniture, the expensive art on the walls, the gleaming hardwood floors, all of it chosen for aesthetic value rather than comfort. The apartment was beautiful but sterile, more like a museum than a home. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" he said, setting down Ethan's small backpack, the only possession they'd retrieved from the abandoned building. "Sarah always said I had expensive taste, but no sense of coziness." Ethan shook his head. "It's like a movie," he said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Do you really want me here? I might break something." The question cut deeper than the boy could have known. How many foster homes had sent that same message? That Ethan was an inconvenience, a potential source of damage, a risk not worth taking. "I really want you here," James said firmly, "and things can be replaced. People can't." He showed Ethan to the guest room, a space that had rarely been used, decorated in neutral tones with a queen-sized bed that dwarfed the boy's thin frame. Ethan circled the room slowly, trailing his fingers along the edge of the dresser as if afraid it might disappear at his touch. "The bathroom is through there," James explained, indicating a door on the far wall. "Clean towels in the cabinet, and I thought tomorrow we could go shopping for some new clothes and anything else you need." Ethan turned to face him, his expression guarded. "How long am I staying?" It was the question James had been dreading. Ms. Patel had been clear. This was a temporary emergency placement while they processed his application for fostering. There were no guarantees. "As long as you want to," he said simply. "I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen." Later that evening, after pizza delivered from Ethan's favorite place, pepperoni and extra cheese, James had learned, they sat together on the couch watching a movie. James couldn't help noticing how Ethan held himself slightly apart, perched on the edge of the cushion as if ready to flee at any moment. "You can relax, you know," James said gently. "This is your home now, too." Ethan glanced at him sidelong. "That's what they all say at first," he replied, his voice so matter-of-fact that James felt his heart crack a little more. "But then something happens. I do something wrong, or they decide they can't handle me, or—" He shrugged. "It never lasts." James wanted to protest, to promise this time would be different, but empty assurances would only reinforce Ethan's distrust. Instead, he reached for the truth. "I'm not perfect, Ethan. I've been a mess since Sarah died. I buried myself in work and shut everything else out. I'm probably going to make mistakes." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I promise you this. I will never give up on you. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Ethan didn't respond, but James noticed his posture relaxed slightly, settling deeper into the couch cushions. It was a small victory, but James would take it. The following days established a tentative routine. James arranged to work from home, managing the cafe remotely while Ethan recovered. They went shopping for clothes and school supplies, though Ethan insisted on the least expensive options despite James's assurances that money wasn't an issue. The boys' medication schedule became a shared responsibility, with Ethan dutifully setting alarms on the new phone James had bought him. Ms. Patel visited twice, clipboard in hand, inspecting the apartment and interviewing them separately. "You're doing well," she told James during her second visit. "But remember, attachment works both ways. You need to be prepared for the possibility that this arrangement might not be permanent." Her warning kept James awake that night. He'd come to care for Ethan more than he'd thought possible in such a short time. The boy's quiet resilience, his flashes of wry humor, the careful way he observed the world, all of it reminded James not just of Sarah, but of himself as a child. Losing Ethan now would be like losing a part of himself. As July 15th approached, James began secretly planning for Ethan's birthday. The cake he'd made originally had been given to a children's shelter, but James intended to follow Sarah's recipe exactly for the real celebration. He ordered decorations online, had gifts wrapped at the stores, and arranged for Melissa to handle the cafe that day. The night before Ethan's birthday, James was putting the finishing touches on the cake when he heard a crash from the guest room. He rushed in to find Ethan thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "No!" the boy cried, his voice ragged with fear. "Please don't leave me. I'll be good." "Ethan," James called, gently shaking the boy's shoulder. "Ethan, wake up. It's just a dream." Ethan's eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first, then gradually focusing on James's face. "James?" he whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "I'm here," James assured him, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You were having a nightmare." To James's surprise, Ethan suddenly lunged forward, wrapping his arms around James's waist and burying his face against his chest. The boy's entire body trembled with suppressed sobs. "They left me," Ethan choked out between shuddering breaths. "They said they couldn't afford another year." James held the boy close, one hand gently stroking his hair. "Who left you, Ethan?" "My parents." The words were muffled against James' shirt. "On my 5th birthday. They drove me to the orphanage with my backpack. Said they were sorry, but they couldn't keep me anymore." A harsh sob escaped him. "They gave me a cupcake with a candle in the car, said to make a wish. I wished they would keep me, but they didn't." Understanding washed over James like ice water. Birthdays weren't just missing celebrations for Ethan. They were anniversaries of the ultimate rejection. No wonder he'd never mentioned the approaching date, despite James's casual inquiries about when he was born. "Oh, Ethan," James breathed, his own eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry." "That's why Miss Sarah wanted to make me a cake," Ethan continued, his voice steadying slightly. "She said we could make new birthday memories to replace the bad ones. But then she left too." The unfairness of it all struck James with physical force. This child, abandoned by everyone who should have protected him, still finding the courage to try again, to trust again. "I'm not leaving," James said fiercely. "I promise you, Ethan. No matter what happens with the social workers or anyone else, You will always have a place with me." Ethan pulled back slightly, searching James's face with red-rimmed eyes. "You can't promise that," he said, his voice resigned beyond his years. "Nobody can." James thought of Sarah then, of her certainty even in the face of death, of the promises she'd made knowing she might not be able to keep them. She'd understood something James was only now beginning to grasp. Sometimes promises weren't about certainty but about intention, about the courage to hope despite the odds. "I can promise to try," James amended, "every single day, with everything I have." Ethan considered this, then nodded slowly. "I can promise that too," he said. They stayed that way for a long time, the man and the boy, both broken in different ways but somehow fitting together like puzzle pieces finding their match. Eventually, Ethan's breathing deepened as he drifted back to sleep, still clutching James's shirt as if afraid he might disappear. James carefully extricated himself and tucked the blankets around Ethan's shoulders. Tomorrow would be the boy's birthday, his first with James, and possibly his first happy one in years. The cake, waiting in the kitchen, suddenly seemed inadequate, a pale imitation of what this child truly deserved. But it was a start, a new memory to build upon, a promise made visible. As James quietly left the room, he paused in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of Ethan's chest. "Happy birthday, Ethan," he whispered. "Tomorrow will be better, I promise." Morning light streamed through the blinds, casting golden patterns across Ethan's bed. He stirred slowly, consciousness returning in gentle waves. For a moment, disorientation gripped him. The soft mattress and clean sheets were still unfamiliar after years of institutional beds and makeshift shelters. Then memory returned. He was in James's apartment, in his room. His room. The concept was still foreign, still frightening in its impermanence. Yet as Ethan glanced around at the few possessions they'd arranged on the dresser, a model airplane kit, some books, a small plant he was responsible for watering, he allowed himself to imagine, just for a moment, that this might last. The aroma of bacon and coffee drifted under his door, accompanied by faint kitchen sounds. Ethan slipped out of bed and padded to the bathroom, where he found a new toothbrush and toothpaste arranged beside the sink. A sticky note on the mirror read, "Come to breakfast when you're ready. No rush." James's handwriting. Neat but slightly slanted, just like the man himself, orderly with unexpected quirks. 15 minutes later, Ethan emerged to find James at the stove, flipping pancakes with surprising dexterity. The kitchen island was already set for breakfast, orange juice poured into glasses that caught the sunlight and scattered tiny rainbows across the countertop. "Morning," James said, glancing up with a smile that didn't quite mask the nervousness in his eyes. "Sleep, okay?" "After, you know." Ethan nodded, embarrassment heating his cheeks as he remembered his midnight breakdown. "Sorry about that," he mumbled. "Nothing to be sorry for," James replied immediately. "Nightmares happen to everyone." He slid a perfect golden pancake onto a growing stack. "Hungry?" Breakfast was a quiet affair, but not uncomfortably so. Ethan devoured 3 pancakes and several strips of bacon, his appetite returning with his health. James seemed content to let silence stretch between them, reading something on his tablet between bites of food. It was James who finally broke the peace. "I thought we might do something special today," he said casually, too casually. "If you're feeling up to it." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Today, July 15th, his birthday, the day his parents had decided he wasn't worth keeping anymore. "It's okay," he said quickly, setting down his fork. "We don't have to do anything." James looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Because it's your birthday, or because it's the anniversary of something painful?" The direct question caught Ethan off guard. Adults usually tiptoed around difficult subjects, especially with kids, but James had never treated him like he was fragile, even when finding him half dead in that abandoned building. "Both, I guess," Ethan admitted. James nodded thoughtfully. "What if we made today about new memories instead? Not replacing the old ones, they're part of you for better or worse, but adding something different beside them." The idea was so similar to what Miss Sarah had suggested that Ethan wondered if she and James had discussed it, or if they had simply shared the same way of looking at the world. "What kind of new memories?" Ethan asked cautiously. "That's up to you. We could go to the amusement park, or the zoo, or that new movie you mentioned. Or we could stay home and build that model airplane. Whatever sounds good to you." The freedom of choice was dizzying. Ethan tried to recall if anyone had ever asked what he wanted to do on his birthday. Even before the orphanage, birthdays had been simple affairs dictated by his parents' tight budget and busy schedules. "Could we maybe do the airplane first, and then the movie later?" he ventured. James's smile widened. "Perfect. And maybe ice cream somewhere in between." For the first time that day, Ethan felt something like excitement flutter in his chest. "Yeah, that sounds good." "Great, but first—" James rose from his stool and moved to the refrigerator. "There's something else we need to do." Ethan's stomach tightened as James carefully removed something large and covered with a cake dome. When James set it on the counter and lifted the dome, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A 3-tiered chocolate cake stood before him, each layer frosted with rich ganache and topped with a riot of rainbow sprinkles that caught the light like tiny jewels. 12 candles formed a circle around the top tier, unlit but promising. "Miss Sarah's recipe," James said softly. "Exactly as she planned it." Ethan stared at the cake, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, not just because of how it looked, but because of what it represented. A promise kept. A circle completed. "She really did plan it," he whispered. "You weren't just saying that." "She wrote it all down. The recipe, the design, even the rainbow sprinkles." James hesitated, then added, "She loved you, Ethan. Very much." The words unlocked something in Ethan's chest. A door he'd kept firmly closed since that day in the car with his parents, watching their taillights disappear down the orphanage driveway. Tears spilled down his cheeks, but for once he didn't try to hide them. "I miss her," he admitted, "even though she wasn't, mine." James's own eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She was a little bit yours," he corrected gently. "Just like she was a little bit mine. That's how love works. It creates connections that belong to everybody involved." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope, slightly worn at the edges. "I found this in Sarah's journal. It was meant for you, for today." With trembling fingers, Ethan accepted the envelope. Inside was a birthday card, handmade from construction paper and decorated with careful drawings of cakes and balloons. The message inside, written in Sarah's flowing script, took his breath away. "Dear Ethan, happy birthday to a very special young man. I'm so proud of the person you are becoming. Thoughtful, brave, and kind despite every reason not to be. Remember that your worth has never depended on whether people stayed or left. You are valuable simply because you exist. My birthday wish for you is that someday you'll find the family you deserve, people who recognize your light and help it shine even brighter. With love, Miss Sarah." Ethan read the card 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his heart. When he finally looked up, James was watching him with an expression Ethan couldn't quite define. Part hope, part fear, part something deeper. "She knew," Ethan said wonderingly. "Even then, she knew she might not be here." James nodded. "Sarah always prepared for every possibility. It was one of the things I loved most about her." He drew a steady breath. "And one of the things that makes what I'm about to ask you so important." From beneath the counter, James produced another envelope, this one crisp and official-looking. This isn't gift-wrapped because it's not exactly a gift. It's a question, one you can take as much time as you need to answer. Ethan opened the envelope with care. Inside were legal documents, the language formal and complex, but the title at the top was clear enough: Petition for Adoption. The world seemed to stop. Ethan looked from the papers to James and back again, unable to process what he was seeing. "I've spoken with Ms. Patel," James explained, his voice gentle but steady. "The fostering process is underway, but this—" he nodded at the papers. "This would be permanent, if that's something you might want." "You want to adopt me?" Ethan's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" It was the same question he'd asked in the hospital, but now it carried a different weight. Now it wasn't about temporary shelter or obligation, but about forever. James seemed to understand. He moved around the counter to sit beside Ethan, close but not touching, giving him space. "Because in the past 2 weeks, I've learned more about living than I have in the 2 years since Sarah died," James said simply. "Because you deserve a home where you're wanted, not just tolerated. And because," his voice caught slightly, "because I think we make a pretty good team." Ethan stared at him, searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finding none, he asked the question that had haunted him for 7 years. "What if you change your mind?" "That's the thing about family, Ethan," James replied. "Real family doesn't change its mind. It adapts, it grows, it works through the hard parts together." He smiled slightly. "I'm not promising it will always be easy, but I am promising it will always be worth it." Ethan looked down at the adoption papers, then at Sarah's card, and finally at the birthday cake waiting on the counter, a promise fulfilled against all odds. "Okay," he said, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 hopes he'd never dared express. "Yes." The smile that broke across James' face was like sunrise after the longest night. Without warning, he pulled Ethan into a hug that felt like coming home. "Happy birthday, Ethan," James whispered against his hair, "and thank you for the best gift I've ever received." Later that evening, after a day filled with model airplanes and movies and more ice cream than was probably reasonable, they returned to the apartment to finally cut Sarah's special cake. As James lit the 12 candles, the warm glow illuminated their faces. 2 people brought together by loss, now finding their way toward something new. "Make a wish," James said, echoing words that had once broken Ethan's heart. Ethan closed his eyes, hesitating only briefly before blowing out all 12 flames in a single breath. This time, he didn't wish for someone to keep him. He already had that. Instead, he wished for the courage to believe it could last. 1 year later, Sweet Memories Café celebrated its grand reopening. The space had been transformed, with one section now dedicated to Sarah's Kitchen, a program that taught baking skills to children from Harmony House and other orphanages in the city. James and Ethan stood side by side behind the counter, matching aprons declaring them head baker and assistant baker, respectively. On the wall behind them hung a framed photograph of Sarah, her smile watching over everything. "Ready?" James asked, his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded, surveying the room filled with children eager for their first lesson. "Ready, Dad?" The word still felt new on his tongue, but increasingly right, like the final ingredient in a recipe that had been missing for too long. As they began the class, teaching small hands how to measure flour and crack eggs, neither noticed Mrs. Chen and Ms. Patel watching from a corner table, matching smiles on their faces. "She would have loved this," Mrs. Chen said softly, nodding toward Sarah's photograph. Ms. Patel nodded. "I think she does." Outside, summer sunshine spilled across the cafe's new sign, Sweet Memories Bakery and School, where everyone gets their wish. Inside, surrounded by laughter and the warm scent of baking cake, Ethan Collins knew that sometimes, against all odds, wishes really do come true. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.